Hello, and welcome to another NABBW Financial Podcast. I'm here with Pamela J. Sams to discuss our August topic, budgets, expenses, and inflation. Oh my, which, by the way, is a deliberate parody of the Wizard of Oz song Lions and Tigers and Bears. Oh my. And pardon me for choosing a title that might seem a little bit lightweight for such a serious topic, but sometimes I think a little bit of levity is a good thing. Welcome to our call. We're happy that you joined us for this, what I think is going to be complex, timely, and for some people, maybe a scary topic. As we dig into our chat tonight, I want to begin by harking back to a White House blog post from April, which was titled Pandemic Prices, Assessing Inflation in the Months and Years Ahead. It was very officious. The post opened with a stuffy beginning that said, the COVID-19 pandemic has caused an unconventional recession, and we do not expect the recovery to be typical either. While the paramount policy goals are to control the virus, get to full employment, and make the necessary investments for a more resilient and inclusive recovery, economic uncertainties and risks demand careful attention going forward. One risk the administration is monitoring closely is inflation. A few paragraphs later, it reports that in the next several months, we expect measured inflation to increase somewhat, primarily due to three different temporary factors: base effects, supply chain disruptions, and pent-up demand, especially for services. We expect these three factors will likely be transitory and that their impact should fade over time as the economy recovers from the pandemic. After that, the longer-term trajectory of inflation is in large part a function of inflationary expectations. Here too, we see some increase, but from historically low to more normal levels. And my thought when I read that is, I guess nobody told the author that it's really smart to talk in such a way that people actually know what you're talking about.
Exactly.
But meanwhile, inflationary impacts are not just a theory to us boomers, especially because many of us have, you will tell us, all of us should have budgets. Many of us have fixed expenses, and very likely as we get into retirement age, many of us are living on fixed incomes. So hopefully you recall that last month we spoke about some research that was conducted by the University of Massachusetts Gerontology Institute. It was officially titled Aging in the 100 Largest Metropolitan Areas, How Do Older Adults Fare? And the research generated a document called the Elder Index, which found that due to inflation, each of the 100 biggest US metros, there was at least 37% of single residents age 65 and older, and at least 12% of older couples that are at risk of being unable to afford basic needs and unable to be able to age in place in their homes. But that was not the worst of it. The report recognized that the situation is much worse in certain places, with at least 60% of older singles and 40% of older couples facing this economic uncertainty. So that's why Pam and I are here tonight, to discuss dealing with budgets and expenses and inflation and how we can best manage these issues. But first, before we get to that good stuff, let me backtrack a little bit and properly introduce this call. Welcome. I'm Ann Holmes, your moderator and the Boomer-in-Chief of the National Association of Baby Boomer Women, an organization dedicated to educating and empowering women at midlife and beyond. And with me tonight to answer our questions is Pamela J. Sams, CRPC, MBA, BFA. Pam is an expert in personal finance, president of Jackson Sams Wealth Strategies in Herndon, Virginia, and a monthly guest who covers important information related to money and financial planning. She's a chartered retirement planning counselor and NABBW's retirement planning associate. And I have one last bit of business before we will launch into tonight's discussion. I just need to play a quick audio here for us.
Securities offered through Securities America Incorporated, a registered broker-dealer, member FINRA SIPC. Advisory services offered through Securities America Advisors Incorporated, a SEC-registered investment advisory firm. Pamela Sams, investment advisor representative. Jackson Sams Wealth Strategies, Securities America Incorporated, and all other entities named are separate entities.
All right. Now that we're official, thanks for joining us again tonight, Pam.
Yes, thanks for having me once again and on this. And I didn't really think about how this really parlays into from our conversation last month,
Mhm.
is that we were talking all about how seniors aren't able to really age in place efficiently, and that deals with a lot of not having their dollar go as far as it can, and a lot of it has to deal with inflations and budgets and extra expenses as well. So when we planned this call, didn't think it would be
No,
complimentary, but here we
I
go.
I was so surprised when I started thinking about what I wanted to say to introduce the call. I was going, well, this really follows right on to what we talked about last month. How cool of us to plan it that way.
Exactly. How cool of us to plan it accordingly.
Right, right. All right. Well, now you've got some important things to talk about here, and I'd like to dig right into it
Mhm.
with the first uh, point that you want to talk about is what is inflation and how does it affect your budget? And I'll give a little preview that you're going to talk about four different things, but
Mhm.
I'll let you talk.
Exactly. So a lot of times people hear about inflation and they really just kind of figure out what it is, but it's really not having your currency or your buying power go as far as possible with that. So at some point, your goods and services and the cost of living is going to adjust for inflation. It's going to be a lot higher. So if we even look 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 50 years ago. The
Mhm.
one fun thing that I like to look at sometimes when I share with my clients is taking their birth year and then showing them how much things cost during that time period, and then looking at what things are today, and then perhaps what they would look like in a retirement, and you can kind of see the shifts and the things go up. Back 50 years ago, the price of a house was, almost as much as a car.
Mhm.
So
Right.
that is what inflation is. You're basically your basic goods and services really are going to increase more over time, and so your dollar is not going to go as far as it did before. Now, I'm sure most people are looking at it and probably jumping a little bit ahead, but groceries, you go in the store and things are costing a lot more than it
Mhm.
used to. So that's what it is. And the way that it affects your budget, of course, if things are costing more, then you have to account for that in your budget, because your dollar is not going to go as far as it had. And you may have budgeted for certain line items based on the typical cost of what you thought it used to be,
Mhm.
but you need to also increase that number. If normal inflation runs probably about anywhere between 2 to 4%.
Mhm.
It may be going a little bit higher, just based on where we are, what you explained, Anne, in that article, because we have pent up demand for services because of COVID. So inflation may be increasing a little bit more, but on the average, it runs somewhere at about 3%. So when I do financial planning for clients, I use somewhere at about 2.5, just to kind of cut the difference,
Mhm.
and then see what that inflates out over time to see what retirement would look like and the cost of what things will be in a retirement. And then, of course, every year you have to kind of look at that. In a 30-year
Right.
retirement, the numbers are going to increase over time as well. So a
Mhm.
dollar today is going to be different than a dollar 30 years from now. And then you have to account for that. So that's how it affects your overall budget. Because inflation can bust your budget just based on the cost of goods and services going up, and when that happens, your dollar's not going to go as far. So you're spending much more on the essentials than you used to.
Well, what your example there of looking at the year you were born, I don't necessarily know things about the year that I was born, but I can remember being maybe 5. My
Mhm,
mother, I was the oldest child, and so she gave me a lot of responsibility, and things were a
mhm,
lot safer back then. But I remember my mother sending me to the store, and I think that I would take less than $1 And, bread was 10 cents a loaf or something like that. And
Hmm.
and I remember when she started to teach me how to grocery shop, once I got old enough to drive, she assigned me to do the grocery shopping. But
Hmm.
she passed on some rules. And one of the rules, she said, don't buy bananas if they're more than 10 cents a pound.
Okay.
Every time I buy bananas, I think the only kind of bananas that are 10 cents a pound these days are the brown ones that all they're good for is banana bread.
Yes, the proverbial we're gonna make banana bread out of those
Right,
rotten,
right.
rotten bananas that we
Rotten
have.
bananas, right. But my brain tells me, these things that my mother taught me when I was very young, and
Mhm.
I have, of course, overcome them, but I do buy bananas that cost more than 10 cents. And I don't ever think I can imagine 5 or 10 cent loaves of bread anymore. But
Exactly. And that's kind of the indicator that you look at, most of the times it'll be eggs, milk, bread. Those are kind of the things that people look at when they say, hey, what's going on with the cost of certain goods and services going up?
mhm. All right, so you say that there's 4 key areas to
Mhm.
watch, and the first one is food and gas.
Yeah. So just like what we had talked about, when you go to the grocery store now,
Hmm.
your dollar's not going as far as it used to. So a gallon of milk, at least in this region, is somewhere close to about $3 for a gallon or so,
Hmm.
3.50.
Right.
And we remember way back when where you can buy, a gallon for 50 cents or $1. So
Hmm.
think food prices will increase. And last year, of course, if people remember, there was a shortage of certain meats because of COVID and the plants closing. So
Hmm.
chicken and beef were extremely high priced during that
Right.
time period. I think the prices have went down a little bit now, but those are some of the things that you have to consider. So I'm sure people weren't buying as much meat last year, probably, of course, concerned about COVID. But number two, it's you're almost mortgaging a house to buy a side of beef last year
Hmm. Right.
with doing that. So I'm sure people were finding some different alternatives for meat products during
Hmm.
that time period. But that's where you look at when you go to the grocery store, the price of groceries are going to be much higher than they were. And that's based on inflation. And of course, it's a supply chain issue as well. So during COVID, and of course during the time period where they were, um, I don't know if you remember the tanker that was stuck in the
Hmm.
Suez Canal thing.
Right.
That also affected kind of supply chain, which
Hmm.
ultimately affects not getting those goods and services in a timely fashion to where it needs to be. Thus, the demand being the demand being high, but the supply being low. So you get a price increase that way, just basic economics
Hmm.
with inflation. But you have the food that happens, and of course, gas. Here, gas are it's probably somewhere looking at people. I see some people equate it to a GPA. It's like 3.4,
Hmm.
3.5
Right.
right now per gallon if you want gas. And of course, we know how gas is regulated. A lot has to do with the oil and where we're getting it and all of
Hmm.
those sort of things. But where the price is at the pump also equates to inflation prices, inflationary prices on the price of gas going up. Now, we remember last year, nobody was going anywhere. Nobody was
Right.
driving. All of our cars were parked in our driveways. And then I think the lowest that I saw, I think I took a picture of it, was probably a dollar or something. No, somebody had sent me a picture where they got dollar, the gas per gallon was like 80 cents or 90 cents. It's like,
Oh,
whoa.
wow.
And I think it was some little small town in, I think Missouri or something like that. But that's where we were during that
Hmm.
time period last year, is that the demand wasn't as high because we weren't going anywhere. So that has a lot to do with inflation as well. Of course, the supply and demand chain, like I said, the basic economics of it, how also affects inflation, but our the bottom line with our budget, because if we have to spend more on groceries and food And of course, now we're out and about and we're traveling and we're driving, then the cost of gas will also go up when you look at that. So that's one of the factors that you look at in an inflationary situation, is that look at what grocery prices are going to cost you with food, and then what's happening at the gas pump.
Mhm. And we all have to eat. So
And we all have to, and we all have to eat, unless we're going back to farming and growing your own grocery or growing your own food. And I know a
Right.
lot of people have done that. I have a couple of neighbors that have a little lot, the little plot in the backyard that they're
Mhm.
growing their own vegetables, so they don't have to buy vegetables in the store. And a lot of times people go to produce markets and things like that, where the cost is a little bit cheaper with that. So people are getting a little bit more creative when it comes to
Mhm.
that, because of the food prices. I'm sure we're not going to be out, slaughtering our own meat or anything, but the basics of maybe some vegetables and things like that may be able to keep some of the food prices a
Right.
little bit lower as well.
Well, I have to slaughtering our own meat. That I have to tell you that about 20 years ago, uh,
Mhm.
before I started my own company, I did video production for a company. I wrote the scripts and was producer for a video production company. And the guy who owned the company, uh, loved to tell this story about how someone from New York City came to town to do some video. I don't know any details. I was not involved with it, but he picked her up at the airport in Chicago and was driving her back to the Quad Cities, even though Quad Cities has its own airport, but
Mhm.
she flew into Chicago. He was driving her back, and she wanted to know, could they stop? Would it be possible that they would be able to get some food? And the way he told the story, he was just so offended by her question about, do you have food around here? He said, well, we would have to slaughter the cow first. And she actually believed him. So
Yeah, exactly. And so yeah, that's a funny story.
right. Well, I guess it's just, in the Midwest where I am and where you used to be,
Hmm.
um, we are much closer to where the food comes from. And apparently, when you live in big cities like New York City, you might not have a clue as
You
to
may
where
not
your
have a
food comes
clue of
from.
where your food comes from. But I remember, old stories that my mom taught me. They had a few chickens when she was growing up in their backyard. And it was St. Louis, but it was a little rural part of St. Louis, believe it or not,
Hmm.
back in the early 40s or 50s. But they had a couple of chickens, and so for the eggs, of course. But
Hmm.
then when the chickens were a certain age, they would go out and get the chicken. And it's like, she was said she would remember her mother taking the chicken and doing what she had to in order
Right.
to get there. And then that's what they had. They had chicken that night.
Right.
So
Yes.
some people do. And I remember growing up fishing as well, going fishing, you bring it
Hmm.
home,
Right.
how to prepare fish. So those principles still hold true, that some people do go out, probably not the cow, but
Hmm.
sometimes fish and chicken and things like that,
Right.
to provide the meat sources that they need.
Hmm. Well, the number two area on your four key areas to watch is one that's particularly important for us as we age, which is medical care.
Yeah, unfortunately, the cost of medical care has increased over time. Copays go up. The cost of premiums, of course, go up with certain plans. And then, I know we've talked about Medicare several calls.
Hmm.
Each year, your Medicare premiums go up based on what your adjusted gross income is, with Part B premiums, and of course Part D with your prescriptions and or Advantage if you go with those programs. But each year you have to look at the cost of your medical care going up over time,
Hmm.
especially with, in addition to that, would be long-term care. Same thing, what we talked about is that the cost of care over time is going to cost you if you need to be in an assisted living facility. That's always regulated by real estate prices and housing. So we're going to talk a
Hmm.
little bit about that as well. but that's kind of where you equate how much the cost of care is going to be for you. Because medical costs eventually, of course, is going to be inflated over time with the premiums for your insurances, and especially as people start to age into Medicare, just know over time that's going to increase. So just had a conversation a few months back with my sister who's aging into Medicare, helping her through all of the ABCDs of Medicare,
Right.
is what I call it. And she was shocked that these prices of
hmm
Medicare, and then depending on where you are with your income. And then I told her each year you would probably expect that number to go up based on what your adjusted gross income could be. It could go up or it could go down a little bit, but you do have to factor in that. And that's just for one person. So there were a couple, so you have to think about what the cost of care would be for two people, and not just one, when you look
hmm
at those Medicare premiums each year for Part B. And then, of course, prescription drugs. And we talked a little bit about in previous phone calls the whole donut hole and all
hmm
of the price of drugs going up as well. So factor in inflation also affects what their medical cost is going to be over time.
All right. And again, like food, we want to be able to afford to have medical care. So it's not really something that we can say, I don't think we
Mhm.
can say that I'm going to have to forego medical care. I don't think we can. Well, some
Yeah,
people do, but I don't think it's a good idea.
it's not a good idea. And unfortunately, those are the things that some people have to make decisions on. Do I get the
hmm
medical care, or do I eat? Or
hmm
do I get, and unfortunately, that's a decision that's often seniors make. Do I continue to take my medication because now the co-pays are so high and Part D is not going to cover everything and I can't pay out of pocket for it. That's a whole nother discussion. I don't want to get on a soapbox about drug prices in this country,
hmm
but sometimes that happens with some seniors is that they forego treatment or forego prescriptions because they just can't afford it anymore because the price of it has inflated so much.
All right. Third area of your 4 key areas to watch is housing.
Mhm. Yes, that was one of that I just kind of touched on a little bit, of course, with real estate prices. And I'm sure in your region as well, Anne, is that you kind of see what's going on with real estate in this country.
hmm
I think it's cooled off a little bit, but all over the country, because of where we are with COVID and remote work, people are living in different areas that they not don't necessarily have to work in. So that has
hmm
really driven the prices for real estate to go up. So the prices of real estate have inflated quite a bit over the last year and a half based on the remote work situation. And like I said, it has cooled a little bit, but the same thing in terms of affordability and because of the inflated prices, are people able to afford certain properties? It's a good seller's market because you can sell top dollar, but then where are you going to go?
hmm
You do have to buy into another property, hopefully,
Right.
or some people continue to rent or whatever they need to do. But that's kind of that catch 22. I can get a lot of profit from my current property, but where am I going to live because the prices are overinflated with real estate. And
hmm
then you have to be concerned about how much you can afford, house you can afford, based on the rates are quite low, but the prices are overinflated with the house. So
Right.
you may not be able to afford a larger mortgage just because the cost of that particular property is much more than it had been, let's say, 2 years ago.
hmm
So people have to be concerned about that. And of course, with an increase in your mortgage or your rents, that also affects what happens with your budget. Because that's usually the biggest expense that most people have in their budget is housing. Where do I, if I either have a
Right.
rent or if, am I paying rent or I have a mortgage for a property. And if those numbers are skewed, even a couple of $100, it can really throw off the whole budget, because you have to now account for that housing, because people need to have some place to live. It's always food, shelter, and transportation are generally the biggest key parts of people's budget. So we do have to have some place to live. So we need to figure out how can we absorb increases in housing prices in my budget over time.
Right. Now, I think that one concept is that you have maybe been living in this big house that you would like to stay
Mhm.
in because you want to age in place.
Correct.
And so you might have people that are thinking, well, then maybe I just need to downsize. But I think
Mhm.
what I'm hearing you say is that if I go and downsize, that downsized place that I want to move to is going to cost a lot more than it
Mhm.
would have cost. So maybe I'm not
Correct.
going to make that much of a savings. And I saw something, I
Mhm.
think it was today or yesterday, AARP was having some um, discussion. I didn't
Mhm.
sign up for it, but I think it was a
Yeah.
discussion about putting a apartment in your backyard or something like that. And
Uh-huh.
I saw that some people that I recognized the names of had signed up for that. So I
Mhm.
was thinking,
Mhm.
okay, so well, maybe that would be a way that you can get some more affordable housing if you keep the same
Mhm.
property that you have, you just make it have more homes on it. Like
Yes.
a
Yeah.
in-law.
Like an in-laws suite, and there's been a
Right.
lot of creative ways to do that. There have been kind of multi-family home
Hmm.
situations where you have multiple generations in one home in order
Hmm.
to afford it as well. I think that has been uh, coming back. Back
Hmm.
in the day, of course, that was always the case. You always had grandmother at home, or
Right.
your grandparents at home with you, and then all of a sudden that didn't happen. But now I believe people are coming back to that particular situation just to make things a little bit more affordable. But also, how do we take care of our aging population, because that's a way to do it as well. So you don't have to worry about mom and dad or grandparents living on their own anymore. Maybe you bring them into a multi-generational home where you can
Hmm.
make it affordable for everybody, but then also take care of your aging population and your aging family as well.
Okay. So it's an area to watch, and there's
Hmm.
lots to consider in that area. Point
Yep.
number 4 on your list. I don't want to rush you on housing, but point number
Yeah.
4 is also important, um, and lots of activity going on. I think in this area right now is credit cards. It seems to me that most of my mail these days is people that are trying to offer me credit cards. So I'm not quite sure
Yes.
why, but
I think, yeah, I know. And it's funny because my 20, well, now he's 23, just turned 23, year old son, every day he would open the mail. He opens the mailbox when he's home, and it's a credit card offer. And
mhm,
so he has tons of them. They keep sending them, and they sending them. And he's one of those who really wants to be responsible with credit. So he didn't apply for any. And I said, you're probably at that age now that you at least need to apply for one, and
mhm.
use it responsibly. And he was just frightened to death on I don't really
Yeah,
want a credit
right,
card,
right,
because
yes.
I've seen and I've heard people get into trouble. And I said, because that's why they're not using it responsible. So
Mhm,
I told them, keep the credit limit low, of course, and then the credit utilization low, so no more
mhm,
than 30% on there, and then you will be fine. So charge some, pay some, charge some, pay some, so you can
mhm,
start establishing credit. But yes, increased credit card is really been out there, and I believe the interest rates are quite high, much higher than they
mhm.
used to be on cards. Now, if you have fairly good credit, you may be able to get better interest rates, but for the most part, most of them are running about 21, 22%,
Right.
because they also have been inflated out, as the credit cards company have to make money somehow too.
Mhm, right.
Uh, so they're going to charge you a little bit more to utilize the credit line that they have given you with that. So that's one of the areas that you have to look at is when you start using plastic, how much is it costing you? Because it is a little bit overinflated than if you just bought the particular item with cash versus
Mhm.
charging it. Now, of course,
Right.
if you have larger items to buy, you can do that. But I always tell people to have a game plan on how you're going to pay it off efficiently because the 22, 23, 25% interest is quite high on an item. So it can really add up over time with inflation. And if you miss one particular payment, sometimes it goes up even higher than that because you're not being as responsible, or at least they don't see you being as responsible with credit that you
Right.
can. So they penalize you a little bit, and there you go, your interest rate goes up on that particular card. So
Mhm.
the credit card is one of the areas to watch with inflated interest rates over time.
I remember the first time I got a credit card, I was working at a department store, and the
Hmm.
department store kind of encouraged its employees to have a department store card.
Hmm.
And I was working at a department store that had a restaurant in it. So sometimes it was just easy to go to the restaurant
Yes.
and get lunch there. I maybe have told
Hmm.
you this story before, but the thing was that I figured out very fast. It took me about a month till the first bill came. But if I charged my lunch onto my company credit card, there's nothing there when I have to pay for it. I already ate that meal and
You
there's
already ate it.
nothing
Yes.
left. There's nothing. It's not like if I bought a pair of shoes, I still have a pair of shoes, or if I uh, bought groceries, I have eaten
Yes.
for many, many days on the groceries, but that lunch is long gone by the time the bill comes.
Yeah, it's
And
long gone.
and
Yeah,
I
and
I
that's yeah.
I was so upset when I figured that out the first time that I got my credit card. I thought I was so grown up,
Yeah,
with my
yeah,
credit card
yeah,
until
and
I
using
started.
it. I
Right.
exactly, and that's what I say sometimes because I do speak with people who are going into college, and of course seniors going into college for the first time, and I tell them this about credit because back in the day, I'm sure it was the same in your time, is that on college campuses they were just giving away
Giving
credit
away
cards.
right, right.
And so many people got in trouble. A lot of my friends got in trouble with that, and me personally, I got in trouble a couple of times with some, and then they ended up having to pay a lot of it back. But what happens is that I always tell them, it's like you could be paying for that pizza party for the next 5 years
Right.
if
Yes.
you don't do this correctly. So try not to charge food, like you said, with lunch,
Hmm.
where that pizza party or that lunch is long gone when you get the bill. And of course, with college students, because they'll see, hey, it's $20 that I got to pay per month. Let me go ahead and pay that. That is the minimum. And that will
Hmm.
kill you with 20 or 21 to 22 to even 25% interest on
Right.
top of that. Like I said, you will be literally paying for that pizza party for the next 10 years if you don't, if you're
Right.
only paying the minimum and you splurge and you did all of that. So be cognizant of how the inflation really eats up. Well, I'm sorry, the inflation affects the interest rate on cards and really how that affects your budget overall. Because then once that interest rate, the interest starts accruing on that particular debt, the $100 that you spend now it's closer to $500 if you're just paying the minimums on that. And so that affects your budget overall too, because now you got to factor in a larger credit card payment.
Very true. Okay, so now we've discussed that inflation seems to be here, probably might reduce, but it's still not going to go back down to the hardly any inflation rates that we were
Hmm.
having there for a while. And some people would probably say that's good for the economy. We don't need to get into that today, but
Mhm.
since we're going to have inflation around, I think the thing that you and I would like to talk about next is ways to budget for inflation.
Mhm.
And you have several of them that we need to discuss. The first one
Mhm.
is reduce your expenses.
Yes, that's always where I start with people with budget is what are you spending your money on in the first place? Of course, like I said, the big ones, shelter, food, and transportation,
Mm-hmm,
generally a car note, groceries, mortgage, or rent. So those are going to be the big building blocks in your budget. But everything else, of course, your cell phone, your utilities, and all of those things. But if you look at where your expenses are and what you're bringing in, are there ways that you can reduce and or eliminate certain expenses out of your budget?
mm-hmm,
So I've talked about it numerous times on calls. Is that I was go through a budget exercise with clients is kind of the necessities, kind of a needs wants column,
mm-hmm.
and then really looking at all of the things that you need and then all of the things that are discretionary. So, some things people may not consider discretionary, but of course, if you're dining out, if you're, going to, you know, get a pedicure or all of those things. Is it necessary? It's good to have, of course. We want to make sure we're self-groomed, that we're groomed
Mm-hmm.
properly.
Right.
But that would fall into the wants column.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe you don't go and get one every week or every 2 weeks. Maybe you reduce that a little bit in order to save money overall. So, funny story to share with you is that I've been cutting my husband's hair basically since we were in college, and believe it or not.
Okay.
so
You
for
must
the
be
past,
you must be very skilled at it then.
yeah, I've been skilled over the years. So and then especially last year with COVID, he started to go to the barber for a little bit, and then COVID happened, and then that stopped. So now I'm back to cutting hair for a little bit. So hopefully when COVID's over, I can get him back into the barbershop. Nonetheless, 30 or basically 33 years since I've been doing this. And so last night, I cut his hair a couple of days ago, and I was like, I'm really exhausted. I really don't want to do this anymore. But he was like, the savings, that all the savings over these years. So he calculated it out last night, because he wanted to tell me how much that we've saved for me cutting his hair for the past 30 years. 32 years actually, and it ended up being close to $10,000. Okay, and so I was like, okay, $10,000 over 30 years, maybe so much. It was just me being tired and not wanting to do it
Right.
all the time. But that's a little bit of that's a fairly big number. Of
Mm-hmm. It
savings
is.
over those years, and of course, if we had invested the difference or whatever, which we probably should have, but we didn't,
Mm-hmm.
and that's a whole nother story.
Right.
But that's where you kind of look at, maybe I don't do it. Maybe you do not, you don't go to the coffee shop every day. Maybe you buy Keurig and you do it at home, or you
Mm-hmm.
splurge and you do it once a week or something. But that's where you look at with your budget is how do I reduce the expenses, or there's some things that you may not need at all.
Mm-hmm.
I am notorious for subscription services. I love, yeah, books. So I have an
Mm-hmm.
Audible. Do I need Audible? Probably not. I can save $15 from that if I don't want to do Audible. Um, I have a couple of streaming services for music. So I did this exercise myself as well. And at the beginning of each year, I generally look at what happened the year before and what did I spend money on? Are there things I can reduce? And so with some of these just subscription services, I was able to free up about $150 just based on that, just going through
Mm-hmm.
my budget, throwing away some of the things that I signed up for, because that's the thing about subscription services. They know that if you put it in place, the likelihood of you going back and canceling it is slim to none,
That's
because
right.
it comes in, it's about $7, $8, $9. You're like, it's not any, but that adds up if you're doing
Mm-hmm.
all of these different streaming services. Now, of course, I'm thinking back in the day where we used to have, I mean, they still have cable, but that was the premise of having cable, because you get all of the channels in one spot. But
Mhm.
now you have all of these different streaming services. You
Right.
have, Netflix, and you have Hulu, and you have all these things. And over time, that can be just as much as cable would be. But that's what happens, is that we think we need to have the latest streaming service, and then we've spent an additional $50 or $60 just based on entertainment there. Are those things that we need? Probably not. Are there things we want? Yes. But can we reduce it if we really want to focus on how do we reduce our expenses on a monthly basis? So it's some hard choices, of course, people have to make with that. Or maybe you just reduce it temporarily. So maybe
Mhm.
you don't do that particular streaming service or subscription or whatever the case may be for several months, and then you implement them again, and you kind of take that to use it, either building up some cash reserve or putting it somewhere else to reduce debt or something. But that's where you start, is how do I eliminate the expenses, especially if you're working with now the cost of food is more, the cost of filling up your tank is more. Where can I cut expenses with some of the other things that I'm doing in my budget?
Mhm. Well, that makes sense. It's really important to think. I think what you're saying is it's questions: do I need it? Do I want it? And can I
Mhm.
afford it? I think
Exactly.
I think
Yeah.
that's what you're talking about. And as far as I I have been, ever since the pandemic, I've been getting my groceries, like most of them, from Walmart,
Hmm.
where I just
Yeah.
go drive up. I order them
Hmm.
in advance. I drive up, they put them in my trunk. So
Yes.
I see the amount, which I just put in this week's order earlier today, and I
Hmm.
saw what it was. And I was thinking, the amount that I just charged out,
Hmm.
that used to be the amount that I would spend in December when I was doing a lot of entertaining and I was making a
Hmm.
lot of special food. But this
Yes.
was just an ordinary week.
Hmm.
And so that said to me, okay, so this is inflation of your food budget, Anne, is that you didn't buy anything out of the ordinary. You're not
Hmm.
entertaining, you're not making cookies and fancy food, and yet this week's grocery bill is pretty much the same as I used to spend for a heavy partying
Hmm.
month, a heavy partying week. So
Yes.
that is something I have to ponder, where I'm going to reduce my food expenses, because I
Yes.
mean I just don't want to be spending that much every week.
Yeah, exactly. Or, that's, and then I know people who, what they call extreme couponing, probably not to that extent, but that maybe there's areas where you could do, couponing, or, find deals or things like
Hmm.
that. Of course, if you want to reduce food. But if you decide that, okay, it is what it is, this is what food is going to cost, are there areas that I can cut to absorb, let's say, the extra $50 or $75 now that I spend on food?
Hmm.
So you look at other areas that you can reduce out of your budget in order to compensate for now the increase in the food
Hmm.
cost.
Right. Well, absolutely. And so you mentioned one of them: reduce coffee shop expenses. Just start
Hmm.
making your own coffee.
Hmm.
And there's a huge amount of money you can save by making your own
Huge
coffee.
amount of money that you can save on specialty coffees and things like that. And one of the stories I want to share, I have a client, she likes buying really nice fancy coffees at different, she makes it at home, but she buys these nice fancy coffees
Hmm.
that the price of the beans are really expensive. And I was like, "Oh, you really need to do that all the time? Probably not. Or maybe I can buy it in bulk, and then I don't have to spend it all the time. Or maybe you go with a different brand that may be a little bit less for that."
Hmm.
So that's where you have to look at, and we're all creatures of habit, so we continue to do the same things. Behavior modification is a little bit different, where you have to say, okay, yes, I like the specialty coffee. Do I need it? No. Are there
Hmm.
ways that I can get the same effect, but maybe not cost as much money?
Right. Okay. So after reducing expenses, uh, The next one that you list here is an important one, but I want you to tell us how we're supposed to be maybe doing better at doing this, which is build an emergency fund.
Yes, budgeting and then emergency fund are always the things I always talk about on every conversation that we have because it always comes up.
Mhm.
But that's the thing that you have to be concerned about as well is when we talked about the credit card situation. If we have an efficient cash reserve, hopefully we don't have to rely so much on plastic, which means we're paying higher interest rates on our cards. So if we have an efficient cash reserve, stash away. So for those emergencies, that's what I'm saying here is really making sure you have enough in cash reserve, something that you can go to. So,
Mhm.
like I said, general rule of thumb is about 3 to 6 months worth of expenses. Generally, that's a fairly large number for most people. But if you can start the savings habit as well. Now, the caveat here, though, is that a lot of people want to keep their cash reserve in savings accounts. And that's the thing about inflation as well. Well, or at least with a lower interest rate environment, is that we have inflation, but our cash is not growing as much. So if we look at our bank accounts or our checking account, not our checking accounts, but our savings account, interest rates on it may be 0.007 or something.
Mhm.
You're not getting
Right.
a whole lot on your cash, which means you have basically dead cash, but inflation where your dollar's not going as far. So that's kind of the caveat of building an efficient cash reserve and keeping it in more liquid type form, which would be savings accounts and money market accounts, but they're not paying a whole lot as well. So maybe looking at something that's fairly conservative, to put it, right now it's kind of under the mattress rates where
Mhm. Right.
you might as
Yes.
well just keep it at home and put it
Right.
under the mattress. But if there's what I always suggest is, are there areas that you can put it, maybe a little bit of conservative mutual fund where you can
Mhm.
get a little bit more out of it. Perhaps you look at money market accounts, they tend to pay a little bit more depending on if they require a minimum of not or not. But you need to look at how do you get the most bang for your buck for your cash reserve, or your emergency fund that you want to set aside. But that's the place you would tap into so you're not relying on your credit cards and then fall into that inflated, interest rate on your plastic because you don't
Mhm.
want to keep relying on that.
Okay. And as you've said in the past, you can start with $5 a week, and
Hmm.
it
Yeah.
won't it won't necessarily build a lot of interest while it's growing, but at least you're putting it aside so you have that emergency fund for when you need it, because
Hmm.
most of us are going to come up to a point sometime when we do need it.
Yeah. Yeah. And just to start the discipline of saving, and just start chunking away at it a little bit at a time.
Mhm. All right. Number 3 on your list of ways to budget for inflation: reduce debt.
Yes. So that goes back to the credit card, that I
Mhm.
was talking about. So if you have inflation in your budget from food or gas or extra medical costs or wherever, having debt really takes away from the buying power that you have on your overall budget to
Mhm.
service the debt. So if you're able to reduce the debt, then you won't have any debt payments and or lower, debt payments. Then that way you can compensate and basically, use those dollars in order to, uh, increase your budget with those
Mhm.
inflationary items that you have that's built into it. Like I say, with the food or the transportation, the food and the gas prices and or maybe an increased mortgage. But that's where you want to do is reduce your debt from there. Of course, I've talked about a couple of different times how to reduce that. Either you use a snowball method, which is paying off the smallest interest, I'm sorry, the smallest balances first,
Mhm.
and or avalanche, which basically means you're paying off the highest interest rates first and then going down from there. The difference of the two, you can choose whichever one you want, but the difference is sometimes paying off those smaller balances give you a little more incentive and motivation because you can
Hmm.
see the balances going down a little quicker. The highest interest rate ones may have larger balances, and it's kind of hard to see the movement over time. So you may get a little demotivated with dealing with the avalanche, but either one of them will work in
Hmm.
your budget. But the name of the game is how do I reduce it as much as I can so I'm not servicing debt for long periods of time because I need that's extra $200, $300 in order to absorb some of the other inflationary things that have occurred in your budget.
Very good. Next point on your ways to budget for inflation. I want to hear more about this one. Find tax breaks. How do you go about finding tax breaks?
I know that's I put that one in there because sometimes you're able to especially if you have younger children or they've increased or not increased, but they've given out the tax incentive for each
Hmm.
child under I think up to 17. So they're giving away extra money for if you have children between 0 and 17. So that has occurred. It's not necessarily a tax break, but it is an incentive that they have given out for that. Same thing with the child tax credit. You get a tax break there that you're able to bring home. Basically, what you're doing is trying to find ways to increase your income overall and or reduce your tax liability. So if
Hmm.
you reduce your tax liability, you will be able to bring home more in your income. So child tax credit, you can take advantage of. Of course, if you're contributing to a retirement account, that will give you a little bit of a tax break because you're using pre-tax dollars into an account where they're reducing your overall income. So you don't pay income tax on that. So for example, if you're making $100,000 a year and you put 20,000 into your 401k or 403b or whatever retirement plan, they're only taxing you on the 80,000. So you're
Hmm.
able to bring home more in your paycheck as well. So if you bring home more, again, you're able to address some of the inflationary things that have occurred in your budget if you're able to bring home more money to compensate for it.
Okay. And the last point on the list that you sent over for us to discuss is invest.
Yes.
So,
So right now the stock market is really hot. So what you can do is look at ways to increase your overall assets or investments. So in actually taking more money to invest, so you can end up growing your assets a little bit more as well. Not to say that it's going to can guarantee that it's going to continue to go up and up and up like it is now, but in an inflationary environment, you're able to increase your assets a little bit more when the stock market is doing well. So
mhm.
using investments in order to grow your assets may also help with some of the inflationary things that are in your budget. These are basically not necessarily the your retirement accounts. Maybe it's a side account where you're doing mutual funds or stocks in a brokerage account to grow money that way. Of course, with the retirement accounts that you have, you're looking at longer term effects of outpacing inflation because you want to make sure you have a sufficient amount of money for a 30 plus year retirement. So again, investing for the longer term, so you would deal with the inflation over time. That's where you want to do that. But the right now in this particular environment, you probably want to look at maybe doing some side investing in order to outpace inflation as well.
A term that comes to me is I think it's a real estate investment,
Trust.
REIT
Yeah.
trust. Yes.
Yeah.
Is that a good situation to look at this point, or not so good?
It depends on which ones. So you want to make sure whatever the real estate investment trust is investing in, they invest in a variety of different things. Some do malls, some
Hmm.
do assisted living and nursing homes. Some do multifamily homes. So it really just depends on which one it is. So you want to take advantage of maybe the environment we're in now, where housing prices are going up, maybe multifamily type unit, or I'm sorry,
Hmm.
multi-apartment units.
Right.
Because right now, because where we are, usually the demographics economically, as you go, as you age, usually should probably be in your first home somewhere in your early 30s or so, at least your starter home. But because the prices are inflated so much, people are continuing to rent longer than they
Hmm.
had before.
Right.
So real estate investment trusts that are in what they call multi-unit apartments, because apartments are going crazy because people can't afford to move into their first
Right.
starter home. Things that, so you want to match the REITs with what's going on economically,
Hmm.
but not getting into ones that may not be beneficial for you.
Well, at one time when I was younger, malls were a really big thing. I'm
Mhm.
not sure
Yeah.
malls are too big anymore.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, exactly. I think especially since COVID and probably the advent, of course, of online shopping, I think the traditional mall as we know it is probably a thing of the past. Because I look at some malls now around in our region, and you go and you see all of the different stores that are closed, and you see just kind of a few anchor stores that are still left. Some of the big anchor stores are actually leaving
right.
mall situations as well. So I think there's a lot more strip malls type things where you
Hmm.
have the outside and that, but not the traditional mall that we're used to. I think, like I said, that's a thing of the past.
Hmm. All right. I have one question that has come in, and
Hmm.
I think that it's one that you would be a perfect person to answer. So
Okay.
uh, it says, Pam, I feel that I need a financial advisor to help me figure out how to deal with this drop in my purchasing power. Do you have advice on how I can find the right person?
Hmm. Yeah, what I generally suggest, I do volunteer for AARP as a community ambassador. AARP has tons of resources in that area. One's called the um, interview and advisor tool. And then they have ways to what type of questions to ask advisors, but also it has some areas on how to find them advisors as well.
Excellent. Um, is there anything else that you'd like to add before we kind of wrap up tonight's discussion?
Now, what I really want to emphasize, of course, throughout this call is inflation is a little sneaky. It sneaks up
Hmm.
on you. And
Right.
before you know it, just like what you explained when you went to Walmart and you looked at your grocery bill and you're like, oh my gosh, this is what I spend during holiday times when I'm making, getting extra stuff or
Hmm.
making extra meals. But now this is kind of the new norm with my grocery bill. So it's sneaky. It sneaks up
Hmm.
on you. And then where you see it is in your ultimate budget. It's like, wait, well, I used to have this amount of money left over at the end of the month. Now I don't have that much. What happened? So
Hmm.
going back through, and I've always been an advocate of having a budget because it helps you focus in on where your spending is going. Because sometimes if you're not careful, these things creep up on you, the inflation, and then you don't have as much buying power. And you're just like, what happened? Where did
Hmm.
it go? And
Right.
like, I'm bringing on the same income, I'm doing the regular lifestyle, but these are some things that you don't have control over. Now, of course, with if anybody's on Social Security or any of the pension programs, a lot of times they have what they call a cost of living adjustment built into them that they increase over time. So you get a little bit more income based on the inflation that has occurred over time.
Hmm.
So if you have those programs, you can, I wouldn't say guarantee, but they increase over time with the cost of living to make sure it's a dollar for dollar type of situation. But just to go through your budget, especially now because gas prices are up, food prices are up, medical costs are high. Credit card interest rates are high as well. Some of these things could be eating up at your budget, and you may not know it because you really haven't sat down enough to analyze where things are going. So I really suggest and highly suggest people go through their budget once again, look at the latest of what has occurred over, let's say, the last month with food and gas and some of these things that you're spending, to see where you are, to see if you can make some of these course corrections or adjustments that I mentioned tonight.
Another thing that's apparently really gone up is construction costs. So
Yes.
I don't know that that's going to impact that many of us, but I read an article about it that basically seemed to be saying, it's another one of those pent up demand kind of things. I know my brother who works in the construction arena, he owns a stone fabrication company. So
Yes.
During the pandemic, he's been having to add staff and work longer hours, like he doesn't have Saturday off. Because everybody says, well, as long as I'm staying home, I want my home to be better. I want to live in a nicer place. And so the construction business has been going well, but that also means that because of the fact that we didn't anticipate construction to go so well, there's a lack of demand. There's a lack of
There's a lack of products and supplies.
Right.
Yeah, because we're actually putting a deck on and our house. I think we're on track for it. We're not using traditional lumber. It's basically Trex, kind of a lumber type product. But for those people who were in that situation, lumber prices were crazy high. And of course, the demand was so high, but then the supply was low for that. So I know some people that are constructing homes have this long timeline now because of getting the materials in time enough to do so. And of course, with that, that increase in price and like basic economics, you have a large supply. Large demand, the price is going to go up. And so they generally pass that on to the consumer if you're in a house build type of situation. So you do have to be aware of that as well.
All right. Well, as usual, you have been a wondrous source of information. It's been great talking to you, Pam. Thank you for another great call and for providing us with this excellent advice on dealing with our budgets and expenses during this time of inflation.
Thank you.
I think a lot of people were going to be very appreciative of participating in this call. I want to tell everybody who's here on the call to, unless you and I haven't discussed this yet, so unless our schedules are unusual, normally our next call would be on the fourth Thursday of the month, which would be September 23rd at the same time. And again, it will be a Zoom call, and Pam and I will have to figure out what the topic is, but there's plenty of things that we can talk about, and I'm sure it will be as timely and excellent as this discussion. So I'm going to tell all of our audience to put September 23rd on their calendar and plan to join us. I think I always ask you if there's anything else that you want to add before we wrap up, and I already asked you that, I think.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Yes, so, I probably shared a lot of information. I'm sure people have to go back and digest, but budget is probably the last thing I want to leave people with.
Okay. Now, how hard is this as you as a financial advisor to talk people into budgeting? Because I think there's somehow a human desire to not be bound by a budget.
Yes, it's very hard, and sometimes I don't really use kind of what I call B word. It's really just understanding the kind of inflows and outflows of your situation, and of course setting parameters. Let's use that, more parameters versus budget on there. But it's extremely hard because a lot of times people think it's more, I don't want to deprive myself of certain things, but it's really understanding, getting a grasp of what's going in and coming in and out of your household. Gives you just more power over where things are going.
Now, I noticed that we didn't talk about people trying to go out and find more work as a way to help themselves over over this inflation, but I suppose
Mhm.
that I've been hearing things lately about like state fairs and things that
Mhm.
can't have buses to get people
Oh
to the
yeah.
fair because they don't have bus drivers. So nobody
Mhm.
apparently wants to be a bus driver. So there must be
Yeah.
some work that's out there that if people are thinking the only way I can see to balance my budget is
Mhm.
to balance
Yeah.
that out
Yeah.
goes is to look at for some income.
Yeah.
I think you would say that there's right now is a good time for looking for
Yeah, it's
opportunities.
a good time. A lot of gig work. I know people are dashing. DoorDash, of
Hmm.
course, is real big. Instacart, of course, and we have it in this area. Hopefully, it's one of those shopping things where you can do just like with Walmart. Well, Walmart's probably a little different, but the shoppers who are able
Hmm.
to do that, a lot of times people get extra hours for that. I have a couple of my clients who are retirees. They just do it because they want to get out of the house, number one, and it also brings in a little bit extra income just to
Hmm.
deliver groceries and go grocery shopping and that. So those are ways to bring in extra income as well.
All right. Well, as I always end this call, I'm going to tell everyone that who is listening that
Mhm.
if you have any questions for Pam after this very information-filled call, you can contact her at Pamela@jacksonsams.com. That's JACKSONSAMS.com. You can go to her website at jacksonsams.com, of course, with www in front of that.
Mhm.
Um, and if you'd like to know more about the National Association of Baby Boomer Women, you can check out our website at nabbw.com. We have a forum, which is not very active in the forum part, but has a lot of content in it
Mhm.
at Boomer Women Speak. And we have a Facebook page that's one of the places where I keep up to date on the topics that you and I talk about, which is
Mhm.
at facebook.com/nabbw. So if anybody wants to keep up to date on the latest things that I find and want to share about tonight's topic, go to the NABBW Facebook page. And we will continue to post articles there that finance is a topic that I think we all need to know more about. So a lot of what I put onto Facebook on the NABBW page has to do with finances. So thank you everybody for joining us and good night. We'll hopefully see you in a month.
Okay, great. Good
Thanks.
night, all.
Thanks, Pam. Good
All
night.
right. Good night.